Okay, so hello everybody. I know that some of you are coming in. And some of you have already been here. So thank you so much for joining us again to another webinar series. I am particularly excited about today's session. So let me say good afternoon and welcome to ESCP Business School webinar. My name is Krishenka McCarthy, and I'm going to be your moderator today. A little bit of housekeeping. All of you should have a circle. It looks red with a question mark in the middle. Make sure to click that for your questions. What I will do is read your questions out loud at the end of the discussion session so that we can have a great flow and a great conversation and actually express your questions properly. This session will be for 30 minutes. And after that, we'll have 20 to 25 minutes for the Q&A. I will have to say sorry to some of you right now if I miss any of your questions, but I will do my very, very best to address all of them. It is now my pleasure to introduce Professor Meg Lee, addressing storytelling in crisis communication. So over to you, Meg, and see you all in the Q&A. See you later.
Thank you, Korshenka. Hi, everyone, no matter where you're joining us here today. As Korshenka said, my name is Hsin-Hsuan Meg Lee. I'm Associate Professor of Marketing at ESCP Business School. So thank you for joining me with this coming 30 minutes. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk to you about storytelling in crisis communication. I'm always looking for different viewpoints and I would love to listen to your stories. So I'm going to keep my talk for just about 25, 30 minutes, and I look forward to our discussion after that. So let's start with a story since we're talking about storytelling. I'll tell you a story of how I got into crisis communication or marketing. In fact, it's now almost 15 years ago. I was young and working on a project to help NHS Scotland promote body image related mental issue. It was a health crisis, a different kind to the ones we're dealing with today. In that process, I realized to have an effective campaign, you need to dance around the narratives of who is ultimately responsible for our own health, what's the role of all the stakeholders in the setting, and eventually I went on studying corporate social responsibility, such as food companies play in the subject field. So my view of storytelling and narratives in crisis have always been centered on the basis that there needs to be a point of view and someone or something has to take the blame. Now let's shift our focus on a more urgent crisis, which is the one we're dealing with now, and also the one we're going to talk about today. I want to first show you an example of a common communication that is used by companies these days. This is compiled by someone named Microsoft Same on YouTube. Some does have storytelling elements, but you will see, I'll show you the video. But I'm just going to also ask you to go to menti.com. It's www.menti.com. I will do a quick survey after you watch the video. So if you can have that ready, that would be really helpful. And now I'm going to switch the screen to the video. Right, so the video sort of continue, but I think you get the idea. Now I'm going to ask you to answer a question. If you could see it properly. Right, so if you can go to www.menti.com and use the code of 633572, and to answer the question of please use an adjective to describe how the combination of the commercials that I just showed you make you feel. I'll give you a few seconds waiting for the answers to come in. So even if you have not seen any of these commercials, because the clips were mostly gathered from American, but you must have also received similar email communications during this time, right? And they use quite similar terminologies that you would hear. They say, we're in this together, we are doing this together, we are here to protect you. And they sort of following the same thread of the storyline, essentially, of what it wants to say. So I can see the answer are sort of coming in. I'll give you a few more seconds to decide what you want to say, and then I will close the voting for now. Okay, I think we're kind of there. Let me stop the voting count just so we can read it a bit closer. So I could see there is a mixture of different adjectives. So there are some positive, some negative. There's a theme of it's being repetitive, a bit boring, a bit frustrated, but you can also see empathy, hope, connected, and with the music, it probably also help. So now let me go back to my slides. Let's see if it's working. Good. All right, so you see the votes from our few, right? So we're bored, a bit disengaged, a bit annoyed, frustrated, and some of you may be reminded about the evil of marketing, though we kind of say the same thing. But why is this, right? Are companies not genuine or sincere in what they say, especially in a time like this? They will be a bit odd. So before we jump into something more specific about crisis, I want to first establish a common understanding of what makes communication effective. So for me, authenticity and relevance are the two fundamental criteria that needs to be fulfilled regardless of the topic you're talking about. Now, I know these terms are being thrown around quite a lot, but I have my own sort of interpretation and definition. So my own definition of authenticity is that communication has to be consistent yet novel. So you want to be true to yourself. So high consistency within your own communication, but not too consistent because you're not a robot. So you shouldn't keep saying the same thing over and over again. And you want to be distinct from others. So you're not repeating the same line of we are in this together as your fellow competitors, but not too distinct, right? Because you still want to hold the category membership that your audience would have a point of reference to associate you with something. So that's authenticity. And relevance, on the other hand, is related to the context of the audience, the context of the environment that you're in, the context of time. So it's a dynamic and forever changing construct. And I will use these two elements as the anchor to define how to successfully use storytelling for crisis communication. There are a number of crisis communication frameworks out there. One that I would like to introduce is what's called situational crisis communication theory, proposed by Professor Timothy Combs in 2007. It suggests that crisis managers should match strategic crisis responses to the type of crisis that you're in, which largely depending on the extent of responsibility and the level of reputational threat posed by a crisis. There are three types of crisis clusters in general based on this theory. One that we want to look at today is victim clusters. In this crisis type, the organization is also a victim of the crisis, such as the current situation, where most organizations have weak attribution of crisis responsibility, which resulted in a mild reputational threat. In general, there are then three types of strategic response that you can consider in this scenario, right? You can remind people how well established you are with all the good deeds you've done, such as you've seen in the video. You can praise the efforts of all the stakeholders and remind people you're also a victim, which we call a victimage. You can see this indeed what many companies have done in their communication in general. So then the problem is if and how can you actually apply all these strategies with storytelling? But before I turn the question over to you, I want to first clarify a few key terms so we're on the same page of what we're talking about. So these terms are often used interchangeably in communication. First is narrative. Narrative is the story by official definition. Narrative is a story or account of events presented by a narrator. There is a critical element of point of view who told the story often implicitly or explicitly share a particular viewpoint. In the context of prices, they can be the attribution of the cost, right? So in that narrative, who is ultimately responsible for a certain thing. Then you have storytelling, which are techniques that you use to tell a story. The end goal of this, when the narrative is right, you hope to eventually create a narrative transportation where the audience of your story are immersed completely in the stories and feel as though it's their own. And finally, you have the elements of stories. There are many typical ones you can think of, like characters, the setting, the plot line, the theme, tone and style, point of view, etc., etc. Now, to bring it back to the crisis communication, I would like to ask your point of view. So I would like to go back to the Mentimeter and answer the next question. Should brands use storytelling in crisis communication? I will now switch to the Mentimeter again. So it's the same code that you were using. And I wanted to ask you, do you think at this point, should brands use storytelling in crisis communication? All right, I can see the yes campus in the lead, and there are some maybe depends, and there are a few no. I would love to know your reasoning. Of course, I will tell you a version of my answer, but it would be really nice if we can have a discussion afterward, of course. All right, so I will wait a bit, but I can sense it's probably the trend is not going to change. You can see most people think yes, and there are some in the maybe depends camp, and then there are very few in the no. Okay, I'm going to stop this, and now I'm going to switch back to my screen. Let's see if you can see it. Right, so I ask you if you think the brand should use storytelling in crisis communication. Most of you think yes, some maybe, and very minority thinks no. If there is an official answer, the answer is no. No, this quote is not relevant to the thing we're talking about today. Oh, I see there's a screen blockade. Yeah. But the official answer is no. Okay, and now you may wonder then why we're here and why we're talking about this at all. Let me explain. So based on many previous studies, one as recent as June 2020, so just published by Clapton, non-narrative communication, so don't use the story, works better in a crisis situation. There are actually many studies have shown and again the same arguments. When you don't use narrative communication, right, so just straightforward plain language, that type of communication during crisis has been proven that will lead to a higher level of trust and brand identification. If you think about it, it kind of makes sense, right? When we're in crisis, who has the time to listen to your stories? Most of us assume people want facts and actions, which are fair, and you should indeed always provide those. You should always have facts and actions indeed. When we talk about communication, we never meant for it to be just a talk, right? You should, of course, walk the walk. But should we abandon storytelling? My view is no. So I'm actually in the maybe depends camp. I think you should tell the story because when you do it right, it can be really powerful. But of course, you want to bear in mind for two things. First is that in crisis, people are not looking for theatrical drama, right? So you want to go light on the stories. Also, crises are typically ongoing and it's a moving event. A full narrative may not be done because you just can't, because the things are still happening. You don't know what's the end to the story. As there are many moving elements and changing context as the larger narrative or macro narrative in the society and the environment is still unfolding. So what I want to bring your attention to is the concept of anti-narrative proposed by Professor David Boji. You can think of it as elements that contribute and build up to the macro narrative that you eventually want to have, but you will only be able to have it fully when things are sort of settled. So you want to accept that what you're trying to achieve now is not a full-on story or a fixed narrative in a living situation. You're telling snippets of the stories to set the scenes, to fit in the overall narratives. You're building the character, you're entering the scene, you're just starting. So every single time when you communicate something, right, that shouldn't be aiming for a full-on, a complete narrative with the beginning, middle, and the end. When you realize the actual end hasn't happened, maybe you're still at the beginning of the stage. So you want to sort of shorten it up. You want to take one particular aspects or angles only instead of going for sort of full-on, very dramatic storytelling. So this is the framework that I proposed as in how you could actually do effective storytelling. Now, in my view, effective storytelling shares the same principle as having effective communication. So some of these blocks are known factors that we would use for building communication. There are four interconnecting blocks: who you are, as in your identity, and who's your audience, what's their story, and then you have the content, as in the stories you want to tell, and finally the responses. What do you want people to do with the story? These four are sitting on top of the context and the environment, which has its own narrative, right? So for example, with the pandemic now, some people in some countries are still in the thick of it. Some are focusing on the next phase, saving the economy. You have some macro narratives like health is important, but economic collapse can be even more damaging. So you want to pay attention to the bigger picture. And in doing that, you would stay relevant, right? Remember, when I say relevance, is depending on the context you're in. So you want to know what's the bigger picture, and then you want to know what's your own narrative sort of sitting on top of this. Story building is a dynamic process. You don't often decide how your narrative are told. Your brand is described and portrayed in the media, your story retold and made up by your employees, consumers, and stakeholders. You don't always have control, but you can get involved. Let me explain a little bit further of all the blocks. First, who you are as a brand. This is typically related to brand personality, personas, identities, which would have been established somehow before the start of the crisis already. In storytelling, this tone of voice, this setting, would translate into characters in the narrative. One thing I want to highlight is that your character is often co-created and negotiated with others. If you do a quick search online, you will see how you want to be seen is not necessarily the same as how people see you, such as the McDonald's example here. When you are a ruthless, competent brand, such as Facebook, for example, it's hard to believe that the brand suddenly then has a heart, right? So if you then present yourself as a very emotional, soft-spoken character, it's not really convincing because it doesn't match with what you usually behaving and what you usually would have done. And then thinking about audience, you have different type of audiences. You have general public, employees, external stakeholders, consumers, engaged consumers. You probably don't have the same stories to say to the different audience groups and don't necessarily have the right stories to say at the same time to all these different people. So you need to have different content planning, but all the anti-narratives should fit into the same overall narrative you're aiming to achieve. In crisis communication, you want to think specifically, what's the role of your audience? Are they also victims because of you? Are they victims because of others? Are you a victim because of them? With this in mind, you can then choose the corresponding characters you want to position in your narrative. In terms of your actual story, most commonly used one in public health communication is probably the war metaphor, where you have a common enemy to fight against. And we'll use a lot of keywords like rage war against something, the warriors, the survivors. But research has shown in public health has shown a lot that this kind of storytelling is dangerous and could create more problem than support. I also find it to be unclear in this line of narrative because who is we, right? This implies that there's a we and we stand on the same side when you may be not. Depending on your audience, you may even be the cause of their crisis, or you may have no role in their journey at the moment and you have no role in their stories at all. So you want to openly acknowledging this, tell the story where it matters. So here is an example from Microsoft Story Lab, which is quite literally a page full of stories. If you scroll down their page, you'll see there are some stories about how the employees are working and helping through the crisis. While this is more of a compilation of stories rather than an overarching storyline, but I do find the narrative to be reflective of their usual line of communication, that the companies are just consist of many stories and they let the employees and customers tell the stories by themselves. And Microsoft as a brand does not have a very strong narrative it holds by its own, but rather a combination of multiple different stories by their audiences. There are many stories and narratives that you can go with this situation, but one particular type of stories that I found interesting and can be useful in the crisis communication is hero's journey. I know this is contradicting with what I just said to not use the war metaphor, but I don't mean to build up on that metaphor. Hero journey is very classic narrative where a character ventures out to get what they need, go through some challenges, and eventually triumph. I found this trajectory to be rather fitting with most companies in crisis situation. But what I want to highlight in terms of how to use it, first, there are many different types of hero. You have all heard of the phrase, not all heroes wear a cape. And not all organizations are heroes. There are many characters in the hero's journey. The heroes can be employees, can be customers, can be some other stakeholders, and there are other roles than heroes. There are villains, there are helpers, mentors, allies, etc., etc. You want to think it through of what roles do you play and what character would be your audience, from whose point of view you're going to tell the story. You want to have the setting before you start building up the character and your narrative. Here's an example of Bolden, a clothing company in the UK. They said in the communication, sort of along the line of, we understand buying clothes is not your priority, but we have printed these nice catalogs before the crisis, and our employees' incomes depending on it. The following communication has then a clear setting of the customers are the heroes in their own journey, and the company is here to celebrate us as a customer. Because let's face it, if I'm individually as a customer is struggling dealing with the crisis, how would a clothing company be standing with me? There will be no we, but it's fine if they take the role of being a cheerleader. I can see that could work, but that's me. I'm their customers, so that makes sense to me. The email was honest to me, reminding me of them also being a victim and allowing me to be the rescuer of the situation by buying more clothes. You may have totally different response toward this, which is perfectly fine. I think it's the organization's responsibility to figure out what's their audience are like. Finally, you need to set a goal in any of the communication. What do you want the audience to do with your stories? There are two things. One is to think about the engagement in terms of how you want them to interact with the information. Then you think about in the crisis context, how would you want the responsibility being attributed? Is that your attention to shift the narrative? From the storytelling perspective, you can think of level of engagement going from acknowledgement as in, okay, I read it, to narrative transportation as in completely immersed in a story, to take action, to share, to retell the same story, or to contribute to the story even. We know in narrative study that the first person stories are usually more engaging, but as a narrator, you don't need to tell the story from the first person point of view always. The Bolden example that I just shared is the first person communication with the audience being the first person in the narrative. So I originally want to end the webinar with the story, but then I've been sharing anti-narrative of my story for 30 minutes now, and I should leave the floor to you. What is your story? So thank you for listening. I think we can take questions now.
Questions now. Yes. Thank you so much, Meg. That was so interesting. I actually learned a lot during this session because even when you were talking about the different responses on whether branches say stories or not, I was quite surprised so many people, so many little people said no. Um, when we were having a conversation earlier, I agreed that in some cases it's a no. So we will definitely discuss that. I have a few questions that I would like to start with.
Sure.
So one of the questions we have is, how can we then show support and empathy to the customer if we don't use storytelling as part of the crisis communication? I think that you said something about that,
Yeah.
but maybe you can expand on this.
Yeah. No, I think you can certainly show empathy and support your customer, but I think then under that scenario, you're assuming your role is either a helper or you're a cheerleader in their situation. And then that's how I would have approached the storytelling. So it's not that you can't,
Mhm.
but I think in communication, it's really important to realize if your audience are ready to hear you and is there any relevant information for them. And I think sometimes we're so eager to share. I'm sure you also experience you receive so many emails during this time that you don't even realize you have, 3 years ago purchased a pair of shoes from a shop, and then 3 years later they suddenly thought of you and sent you an email. to tell you that they stand with you, then that become really odd, right? And that
Yeah.
will become very insincere in the sense that it's not relevant to me. I don't even remember I was once in the newsletter or email list. So I think
Mhm.
it depends on the context, but there can certainly be a role. But then again, when you want to show sympathy and empathy and support to your customer, I think sometimes not bugging people would be a good thing to consider. I'm not saying never, right? But then again, going back to the context, I think it depends on the time and sort of the timing and how relevant it is for your target audience at that very moment, how important it is for them to hear from you that you say you support them.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I think that when we were thinking about the crisis and the pandemic, I heard from different people. They're like, "Oh, that company said nothing," or "Oh, that company should have done something." But then also when they do say something, it's like, "Oh my God, what did they do? What did they say that?" So it is a very complicated thing, but I think that we have this perception that we have to stand for something. And sometimes we don't think, well, that company could probably be making a huge mistake if they do.
Yeah.
So it makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. I think now also sort of tangling up with the social issue, right? So we do have some kind of expectation that the companies have to stand for something, but I think what's often missing in this is that if you don't do it, right? So you don't take
Mhm.
action, which is the premises of any communication, you should have taken action. So if you don't take action, you're just literally saying things,
Mhm.
then the question would be how close you are to your audience and how relevant it is for them to hear at this moment that you say you stand for something when you have shown no actions toward that particular issue and you have no interaction with people up till that point.
Right.
Then why should I spend, so many minutes of my life to even consider your communication?
Yeah, that is correct. And actually, the following question is very interesting because it's around the same topic, which is ethical implications. So, of communication or communicating a story when people are still being affected at this moment, it will be COVID-19, but then businesses are still reopening and things like pubs are being reopening and there's still restriction in some areas, but then in some areas you're already having a party. So how as a business, are you going to be careful to say, well, we need to survive. So we need you to come to the pub, but at the same time, yes, there's other people still suffering for this thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so right, so what you were describing is already two layers of the situation, right? One is the bigger context or what's the overall narrative is in the world. Yes, there are still people suffering, so we're not really celebrating. But the other is sort of more close to the companies, which is what you're describing. Essentially, you're telling your audience that you're also a victim of the situation, right? Your business is suffering by people not coming. Of course, it's not their fault, but you are also a victim. And actually, in sort of crisis communication, it is okay from time to time to show people that you are also a victim if you're really honest with your communication, that you acknowledge that I'm now being a victim of this. I really do need support and help. We do this in a sensible way, right? So you're not sort of going outright cheerful for all kinds of different parties situation, knowing what's happening in the background. But you may want to frame it in the context that we need your help. And if you are really sort of had enough of lockdown and you want to sort of ease in to a new normal life that we have, we're here, we're ready, and we will do this together, right? In that context, you can actually do things together because they involve your audience having to come in to consume your service and products. So I think it's about sort of framing, like how you would approach it, and if you're honest with your communication.
That makes complete sense. And jumping ahead to another comment, which I think is very interesting, actually. Does the notion of storytelling implies that the notion that crisis communication management is marketing as usual?
Very good
Yes,
question.
very good
Um,
question.
yeah, I would actually take it as the flip side because like I think when people the point of view of claiming it's marketing as usual, you implicitly assume it's evil to do marketing. So you don't
Yeah.
like it when it happened in this context, and that's why you have the remark of is it marketing as usual? But then I would argue, right, there are different ways to practice marketing, and my belief of doing marketing is that you should really consider. So it's a customer-centric view that I'm holding. I think you should really consider what your customer needs, wants are, and what kind of value you could best provide and serve them with. So if you, from that perspective, then I would argue, especially during the crisis, you should still doing this, right? You should really put your customer at your heart. Of course, also consider your stakeholders and really see what kind of role you could play in their own trajectory, in their own journey. And do you really have a role to play in there? And I think I would argue also one thing that I haven't really talked about, but also very important is that as a company, you don't just face the customer, right? You also have your suppliers, you also have your distributors, like so they're both upstream and downstream partners in your business where you certainly have a role. And when your business go down, their business may go down. There will be a chain reaction, right? So I think it's not to say marketing as usual as in like a negative connotation to it, but like I think marketing as usual is in you are aware, you are in this ecosystem and you play a role in sort of how to indeed going through the crisis together, but you sort
Mhm.
of fulfill your role in an ethical and socially acceptable manner, I would say.
Right. And that makes complete sense. And I'm loving these questions because they're all tying up to what we're saying. So here is an example about the airline industry, which is it's a super cloud on top of us, where
Yeah.
it says, they have been hit very hard with the crisis. They have let a lot of people down. How do you think they could have handled the crisis communication better through storytelling?
Yeah, so that's really good question because that was an example that I was originally thinking, should I, if I can find one, if I would show, but I think airline is especially interesting because they're definitely also a victim to the crisis. So a lot of things is out of their control. But then I also read comments by people of like, oh, you want us to now wait for reimbursement, like be patient with you. But where were you when my luggage is overweight? You want to charge me extra on the airplane.
Yeah.
So, and then I actually think that kind of reflect how you usually are. I think some
Hmm.
airline has a sort of more friendly and more sort of overarching narrative before the crisis is that they are indeed very customer centric. They're here to help,
Hmm.
they're here to provide service, to take you to your destination. When they're more true to that, I felt that the audience in general are more forgiving. That while of
Yeah.
course you will always have people who are not satisfied with the situation, but when they say please bear with us. We are also suffering. We're doing our best. It will take some time for us to reimburse your ticket. We try to be quick with
Hmm.
your communication, but it's important the information is accurate, etc., etc. All of those seems to receive positive response compared to the brands that had never had such an image, and they're always just in it for the profit. And
Yeah.
then, of course, in that context, it's going to be very challenging for them to then suddenly turn around and say, "We're here to help. We're in this." You're not going to believe it because they're here for your money, and now the money's gone, and
Yeah.
you just would not have a role. And I think that's why it's important to actually, like from the narrative and storytelling perspective, people would say you shouldn't just think about storytelling when something happened, right? You should have your overarching narrative throughout. The
Yeah.
moment when you set up your brand personality, when you are thinking about your identity, you're already thinking about what kind of journey you're going to be on. then in that sense, it would make it better, right? It would not change completely. You will always have people not satisfied with whatever it is that you do. But I think it will make the storytelling easier in the sense that you're not recreating yourself in the time of crisis. You're just
Yeah.
following your overall trajectory.
That's very interesting because it just popped into my head, that concept of also making sure that you are building a story before the crisis hits. And I think that even as marketing people, sometimes we think about, oh, what's the contingency plan if something doesn't work? But we are not thinking about crisis. I mean, I think that now with the new crisis, there's going to be a complete shift of how we work, because now we're thinking, what if something happens? How do we keep our customers? How do we know who loves us or who hates us, from that standpoint? So that's very interesting. Um, I would like to jump a little bit about the heroes. So the hero story for me was a complete highlight, and we have a question on that. In hero stories, won't the consumer always be the heroes, unless you're providing essential services?
Yeah, good question. I was thinking about all kinds of possibilities of like in hero's journey, but I think I wouldn't. So you probably definitely not going to have your customers villains in any case. Um, but no, I don't think customer would always have to be hero in this story. They can be mentor, they can be helper, they can be cheerleader of the company who are suffering, right? So going back to the pub example of they want now they are fighting for survival, right? And then the customer who you want to invite back in would essentially become the helper for you to fight. And that's why sometimes you hear the story of like, oh, they're a corner cafe, right? They're struggling to now survive the crisis, and they really want and need your help. So in that sort of story arc, you're a helper as a customer. You're
Mhm.
not necessarily a hero. So I don't think it's always the case for customer to be a hero, but I think if you sort of build your hero's journey for like a sort of
Mhm.
long narrative, you can have plot twist, right? It's like, oh, an episode happened, there is now a crisis. In that particular episode, maybe indeed the customer will be the rescuer or there will be a hero for that particular journey. But I actually tend to think most companies, when maybe they're not really thinking about this, but usually, like if you observe entrepreneurs, they would position themselves as the hero, right? They create the solution, they create the service, they're providing the product that you need. They're the answer to all your problem, which by default makes the company a hero. So it's actually usually the other way around. What I want to remind people is that you don't always have to be a hero, but of course you don't always have to put your customer to be a hero.
That's very interesting because when we think about crowdfunding, for example, crowdfunding is about asking others to be heroes, right? So it's this idea of, we want to make something happen and we can only do it if you do it. And there's a lot of, charities who use this perspective, right? Of, we have this mission, we cannot do it without you. Be the hero for someone. So it's almost this concept of heroes changes depending on what you're
Yeah,
trying to
but I
do.
but see, in that particular context, I would actually think companies still think they're a hero. They say you're a hero, but they actually mean you're a helper. You're helping
Right.
them to fulfill their dream. They are the hero who have a dream, right? And you're there to play your part as in supporting them financially
Right.
so they could fulfill their dream. So in that sort of macro narrative, they are still the hero. They may call you a hero, but the way
That's the trick.
crowdfunding
Yeah.
works, that, that they
That's the
are the
trick.
hero eventually, and you're
Yeah.
like there to help.
Yes, that's definitely a trick. Let's move along because I'm liking all the questions. Thank you so much, for those questions. They're great. Which type of message is better? Is it comforting and embracing the current situation? We are in it together. Oh, we've heard that so much. Or embracing a better future. Things will get better.
Good question.
Mhm,
So in the concept of anti-narratives, where you're sort of building snippets of the overall narrative, you can actually do both. So you could have the part where you are sort of anticipating where the story goes, right? So you're looking forward to the future, so you would provide sort of storyline that it's imagining
mhm,
how the future gonna be like, but you can also have what's happening now, what's like the underlying, what's happening in the background. So you can actually do both. In general, as most professor, if you ask them any question, they'll tell you it depends. Um, so I will say you can actually do both. I don't think it's an either or situation, but then again, it really depends on the context and your audience. So not all audience are looking forward to hear the future story about you, right? So if you're doing internal communication with your employee, very important, because the future of the company also influence the future of the employee. That's probably the most relevant information they're very keen to find out. But for your customer audience, maybe it's more about now. They just want to survive now. They just want to get through it now, and they're not so much interested in what you're going to do and what kind of
mhm.
great thing you're going to have 3 years down the line, for example.
Yes, yes, it's very, very interesting. Thank you for that. We carry on. How can storytelling be used to communicate a change from before pre-COVID to after the new world, the new you, how you've changed? So this is now talking about recovery, right? So
Yeah.
let's leave the crisis behind. We have lived the crisis. Now we're building the blocks and trying to build a house again. How would they do that without, kind of taking advantage or sounding that they're taking advantage of a crisis?
Yeah, so my own view on this is that I think the craving of the stories will be the same, right? We're always looking for good stories to hear and to tell and to retell. But I think the crisis have sort of changed the way we function, as in we all become less patient of things, that we are sort of the normal annoyance level is
Yeah.
up. So we're less patient with the things that doesn't match with our expectation. So we're
Mhm.
less patient to read yet another email. We're less patient to watch yet another video. So I think the bar has raised just higher. So it has always been going on with this trend, but it just sort of accelerate because of the crisis. I think it will really come down to the storytelling techniques. Like you really have
Mhm.
to be able to carve something different than others. But then again, going back to authenticity, something very hard to achieve, right? You have to be different but the same. So you
Yeah.
sort of, that challenge will become even more extreme. And I think the companies who do well will be those that they have develop a brand personality. They have their own narrative, sort of they're sticking to the line. And then so all of these anti-narratives that they insert with their communication, which just contribute continuously to
Mhm.
their overarching storylines, whereas others may find it difficult to stay relevant in the post-COVID world. That's my personal view.
It makes complete sense, and I think I'm going to follow up with the next question, which is it possible to create a storyline when your brand or your company is trying to adapt to context change? You
Yeah,
had to think this question was coming.
yeah, no, we have, yeah, so we had this discussion earlier, it's the earlier communication that we had. Um, I personally find it hard to,
Hmm.
with the intention to change your sort of brand with just by storytelling. I don't think it's impossible. I think it's quite hard, especially if the narrative that you're aiming for is going against the narrative that
Hmm.
people have prepared for you. So it require a lot of consistent changes in your behavior as well as in your communication. So for example, with the health, with the obesity research that I was doing, I was focusing on the brands, right? And the overarching narrative is that the brands are taking responsibility. But then if you really follow that narrative, you shouldn't even exist because you're selling fast food. Um, so then there are companies trying consistently to change their narrative, right? So while shifting the responsibility to individuals by providing more healthy options, then they will repeatedly tell the story over the years, but not with the intention to change it to become a healthy option, right? Because they will never happen. But then you will see they continuously changing or shifting the story, so you focus on other value than thinking it's unhealthy to you. And I think so it's not
Mhm.
impossible, but I think it takes consistency and also changing of your behavior. So it's not just, oh, I keep telling the story and one day people will be convinced by it, right? It has to go
Yeah.
with all of the rest of the things that you're doing in your organizations.
So the organization's culture will also have to change, which is a whole different conversation. Because
Yeah.
if you have the story, but people are not following the story, then how does that work? So
Yeah, totally. Like your story, like we sometimes talk about organizations like it's a standalone entity, right?
yeah,
But it's actually formulated by all the employees
yeah,
that you have as well, right? So and that's about organizational culture. So you want to tell a story. Typical thing we do is that we through internal communication, we tell our employees, this is the story we want you to tell. And they usually don't tell it that way to other people because they have their own view and they
yeah,
have their own story. So one really critical element, storytelling in organization, is that you want to involve your employees. So you want them to be part of the story. It's always sound nicer when it's coming from a real person than this sort of organic organism of organization, right? So
right,
you want to involve them, and while you're involving them, they will shape your narrative. You cannot force something to happen when it's not in your organizational culture. It's
right.
just not done. So all the things has to happen simultaneously, and they go hand in hand.
Correct. That's definitely true. And here is it's more a comment rather than a question, but um we have they say I totally agree with the excessive storytelling with counterproductive effect in crisis that I see every day. People want facts and actions by government dealing with COVID-19. But I think that it's even beyond COVID-19, right? I think that now we're living in a life where people are becoming more free, more open, more understanding of their surroundings. And now it's coming to a point of, okay, we want actions now. Okay, we talked about the theory, we know the history, it's been bad, sad, or strange, but now how do we move forward? This concept moving forward, and I think isn't now that we talk about government, how can the government use storytelling to move forward? Because they have used storytelling in the past just to say, to keep us safe, not to do this or avoid this, or we're here for you. But we're now in change, as you said before. How can they, do you think that they could potentially support the culture to also move forward with positive communication?
Yeah. So I think the challenge with government is that because they're facing such a wide audience, and when they often attempt to use stories, they would fall into the trap if people would say, "Oh, you're just finding a model citizen, you're finding a model companies, and that's not our life, that's not reality." And so I think it's important that you try to avoid, though I understand it's hard with government messaging, but like ideally you want to still consider your audience, right? So different audience should receive different kind of message, which should be consistent with the overall narrative, of course, but the way you tell the story should be different, just so you can be more specific and more targeted, and you can stay relevant for indeed the actual sort of group of people who could resonate with the story you're saying. Otherwise, you often, like I was reading a poll asking if the people in Britain has gone to a pub this weekend because it's open. And then in sort of that narrative or thread of discussion, you have a lot of people saying, but it's not open in our area, right? In Wales and Scotland, it's not open, so it's not Britain, it's only in England. So even just this, right? So if we're going to communicate, oh, we're going back to the life, we're moving forward, we're rebuilding our economy, even just by geographic restriction, right? Then the message should really just be for the area that would be relevant for them. Otherwise, you're just telling a fairy tale because it's not the reality of people who are living in. So I think with government it's especially tricky because people are quite particular with the consistency of your messaging. So if they really find out that you're saying different thing to different group of people, of course it's going to be a problem. So that's not what I meant. I think you should say the same thing, but you should say things differently. The same thing differently for different people.
I totally agree with that. We have some few questions, so I'm gonna cherry pick some because some of them seem to be the same. Um, will you agree we're beginning to witness a storytelling fatigue among people? They know, understand, can smell the story and their intentions behind. How do we cope with this?
Right, so if you recall the video that I showed you at the beginning, then it's certainly a storytelling. No, it has a nice somber music to start with. It has a clear messaging, and then it has the arc. And then what I didn't show you at the end is that the music usually picked up, and it's like upbeat at the end, so give you hope. So there is storytelling, and I think the fatigue comes from it's the same story, right? But it shouldn't. Why would it be same story? It shouldn't be the same story because we're all different people, we're a different organization, we're different countries, we have our own history, our own trajectory, our own sort of persona, personality, identity, setting. So I think the fatigue usually comes from that you don't have that, or you don't sort of integrate the story that you want to say at that particular time into your whole narrative. So it will sound really fragmented and out of place, and then just end up being exactly the same as the brand next door. And that's why we're not moved, we're not influenced, and also because a lot of techniques are used quite commonly. So if you don't like, then it goes to the creative development of any kind of message, right? So if you don't think of a creative way to tell the same story, it gets boring quite easily because now we're used to it. We hear somber music, we know the intention is for us to feel moved. We hear upbeat music, we know it's time to think of future. So it's like the more marketing go on with the same practice over and over again, creativity will become then very, very important because it will allow you to, even if it's the same story being told 100 times, you will still find a new way to say it.
Yes, of course. And that's the problem, right? That's the problem that you just every single brand. But I think that it's almost a behavior. I wouldn't want to say consumer behavior, but it's almost like a business behavior where it's sort of like, oh, they use that slogan, we should use it too. Oh, they use that song, we should use it too. Oh, they use that voice, we should use it too. Instead of, oh, we should do something different or complement, which is a different strategy. But I have another question that walks us away from particular COVID-19, which I'm very happy about. Just because there's also many other crises
Yeah.
happening right now. Do you need to actually communicate during crisis? That's one of the questions. Because, for example, there's a big backlash for L'Oreal in the Black Lives Matter. Isn't it best just to not reach to that stage, not go there, or maybe be a little bit more passive about it?
Yeah, so I think good question. I don't think companies always have a role in everybody's stories. But then again, you have so many different audience, right? So then it's important that you think it all through, right? Do you have something to say to general public? Do they want to hear your story now? Do you have something to say to your employee? Do you have something to say to your suppliers and all of those, right? So you want to So check that, and then I agree, you don't always have to say something at that point um, in the development. But then sometimes what you notice is that if the context, right, the overall, there's a narrative in the environment where people are asking for companies to take a stand. Then in that case, then you would need to do public facing communication. But then again, if you haven't done anything, so you didn't take any action, you didn't do anything to actually address the issue that you are going to talk about, then whatever story that you're telling, it's going to sound very superficial because there's no nuance into the actual characters that it's in the story. So yes, if you haven't done anything in regarding to sort of other crises, you haven't made any plans, you haven't made any changes, then I don't even think you will have a story to say. Like what are you going to actually
Yeah.
say to sort of play your role in there? So I think the premise is always you need to do something. And if you feel that situation doesn't call for you to do anything, so you haven't done anything at all, then why communicate? Like, and then you're going
Correct.
to talk about empty messages.
Yes, I completely agree. I think that in topics like that that are more humanitarian, I have seen some brands that actually they're very honest. They have actually apologized for not
Mm,
talking about issues that impact human beings. And after apologizing, they have made a new commitment to the community or to their customers that they will address it moving
yeah,
forward. And I think that's more authentic because now is this concept of authenticity. Do I really say, sorry, I made a mistake, I didn't even think about this, and then move forward? Or should I be quiet? And I think that now people are expecting companies not to be quiet. Even if you're wrong, say it.
yeah,
Um,
for sure. I will agree
yeah,
to that.
yes. So I think that will be definitely part of that story that you're telling about what the culture of the company should be or how you want to progress. Um, on that note, we actually have reached the end
Yeah.
of our webinar, which I'm very excited about. I've always, there's a few questions that I was not able to answer or ask to Professor Lee, but um, we do appreciate your time with us today. This topic was very close to my heart. I actually really appreciate today's topic just because it's something that we're dealing with every day, even to brand ourselves and to tell our own stories. I appreciate your time, your commitment to ESCP, and I hope to see you on our next webinar. We're going to have a few more before or during the summer before we actually end the series. So I do hope that you come back and connect with us. Meg, thank you so much for your time.
No,
It
thank
has
you for
been
having me. It was a pleasure.
amazing. And we will have a recording of this session, so you will be able to look back. And if you wanted to connect with us, we will definitely be sending you a follow up email so you can connect with us and learn from our other seminars. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening and see you soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.